Chapter 20 of the Enchanted Barn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Mattern. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 20. The cement floor had been down a week and was as hard as a rock when one day 2 or 3 wagon loads of things arrived with a note from Graham to Mrs. Hollister to say that he would be glad if these might be stored in one corner of the basement floor where they would be out of her way and not take up too much room. Harley and George went down to look them over that evening. "He said something about some things being taken from the office building," said Harley, kicking a pile of iron pipes with his toe. "These don't look like any old things that have been used," said George thoughtfully. "They look perfectly new." Then he studied them a few minutes more from another angle and shut his lips judiciously. He belonged to the boy species that has learned to "shut up and saw wood," whatever that expression may mean. If anything was to come out of that pile of iron in the future, he did not mean to break confidence with anybody's secrets. He walked away whistling and said nothing further about them. The next day Mrs. Graham came down upon the Hollisters in her limousine and an exquisite toilet of organdie and ribbons. She was attended by Elizabeth, wild with delight over getting home again. She begged Mrs. Hollister very charmingly and sincerely to take care of Elizabeth for 3 or 4 weeks while she and her husband were away, and to take her entire family down to the shore and occupy their cottage, which had been closed all summer and needed opening and airing. She said that nothing would please Elizabeth so much as to have them all her guests during September. The maids were there with nothing to do but look after them, and would just love to serve them. It really would be a great favor to her if she could know that Elizabeth was getting a little salt air under such favorable conditions. She was so genuine in her request, and suggested so earnestly that Shirley and George needed the change during their vacation, and could just as well come down every night and go up every morning for a week or 2 more after the vacations were over, that Mrs. Hollister actually promised to consider it and talk it over with Shirley when she came home. Elizabeth and Carol nearly went into spasms of joy over the thought of all they could do down at the shore together. When Shirley came home she found the whole family quite upset discussing the matter. Carol had brought out all the family wardrobe and was showing how she could wash this and dye that, and turn this skirt upside down and put a piece from the old waist in there to make the lower part flare, and Harley was telling how he could get the man next door to look after the hens and pigeons, and there was nothing needing much attention in the garden now, for the corn was about over except the last picking, which wasn't ripe yet. Mrs. Hollister was saying that they ought really to stay at home and look up another place to live during the winter, and Carol was pleading that another place would be easier found when the weather was cooler anyway, and that Shirley was just awfully tired and needed a change. Supper was flung onto the table that night any way it happened, for they were all too excited to know what they were about. Carol got butter twice and forgot to cut the bread, and Harley poured milk into the already filled water pitcher. They were even too excited to eat. Graham arrived with Elizabeth early in the evening to add his pleading to his mother's, and before he left he had about succeeded in getting Mrs. Hollister's promise that she would go. Shirley's vacation began the 1st of September, and George had asked for his at the same time so that they could enjoy it together. Each had 2 weeks. Graham said that the cost of going back and forth to the city for the 2 would be very little. By the next morning they had begun to say what they would take along and to plan what they would do with the dog. It was very exciting. There was only a week to get ready, and Carol wanted to make bathing suits for everyone. Graham came again that night with more suggestions. There were plenty of bathing suits down at the cottage of all sizes and kinds. No need to make bathing suits. The dog, of course, was to go along. He needed the change as much as anybody, and they needed him there. That breed of dog was a great swimmer. He would take care of the children when they went in bathing. How would Mrs. Hollister like to have one of the old Graham servants come over to sleep at the barn and look after things while they were gone? The man had really nothing to do at home while everybody was away, as the whole corps of servants would be there, and this one would enjoy coming out to the country. He had a brother living on a place about a mile away. As for the trip down there, Graham would love to take them all in the big touring car with Elizabeth. He had been intending to take her down that way, and there was no reason in the world why they should not all go along. They would start Saturday afternoon, as soon as Shirley and George were free, and be down before bedtime. It would be cool and delightful journeying at that hour, and a great deal pleasanter than the train. So one by one the obstructions and hindrances were removed from their path, and it was decided that the Hollisters were to go to the seashore. At last the day came. Shirley and George went off in the morning shouting last directions about things. They were always having to go to their work, whatever was happening. It was sometimes hard on them, particularly this day when everything was so delightfully exciting. The old Graham servant arrived about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and proved himself invaluable in doing the little last things without being told. Mrs. Hollister had her first gleam of an idea of what it must be to have plenty of perfectly trained servants about to anticipate one's needs. He entered the barn as if barns were his native heath, and moved about with the ease and unobtrusiveness that marks a perfect servant, but with none of the hauteur and disdain that many of those individuals entertain toward all whom they consider poor or beneath them in any way. He had a kindly face, and seemed to understand just exactly what was to be done. Things somehow moved more smoothly after he arrived. At 4 o'clock came Graham with the car and a load of long linen dust cloaks and veils. The Hollisters donned them and bestowed themselves where they were told. The servants stowed away the wraps and suitcases. Star mounted the seat beside Harley, and they were ready. They turned to look back at the barn as the car started. The old servant was having a little trouble with the big door, trying to shut it. " That door is a nuisance," said Graham as they swept away from the curb. " It must be fixed. It is no fit door for a barn, anyway." Then they curved up around Allister Avenue and left the barn far out of sight. They were going across country to the Graham home to pick up Elizabeth. It was a wonderful experience for them, that beautiful ride in the late afternoon; and when they swept into the great gates and up the broad drive to the Graham mansion and stopped under the porte cochere, Mrs. Hollister was quite overcome with the idea of being beholden to people who lived in such grandeur as this. To think she had actually invited their son to dine in a barn with her! Elizabeth came rushing out eagerly, all ready to start, and climbed in beside Carol. Even George, who was usually silent when she was about, gave her a grin of welcome. The father and mother came out to say good by, gave them good wishes, and declared they were perfectly happy to leave their daughter in such good hands. Then the car curved about the great house, among tennis courts, greenhouses, garage, stable, and what not, and back to the pike again, leaping out upon the perfect road, as if it were as excited as the children. 2 more stops to pick up George, who was getting off early, and Shirley, who was through at 5 o'clock, and then they threaded their way out of the city, across the ferry, through another city, and out into the open country, dotted all along the way with clean, pretty little towns. They reached a lovely grove at sundown, and stopped by the way to have supper. Graham got down and made George help him get out the big hamper. There was a most delectable lunch. Sandwiches of delicate and unknown condiments, salad as bewildering, soup that had been kept hot in a thermos bottle, served in tiny white cups, iced tea and ice cream meringues from another thermos compartment, and plenty of delicious little cakes, olives, nuts, bonbons, and fruit. It seemed a wonderful supper to them all, eaten out there under the trees, with the birds beginning their vesper songs, and the stars peeping out slyly. Then they packed up their dishes and hurried on their beautiful way, a silver thread of a moon coming out to make the scene more lovely. Doris was almost asleep when at last they began to hear the booming of the sea and smell the salt breeze as it swept back inland. But she roused up and opened wide, mysterious eyes, peering into the new darkness and murmuring softly: "I want to see the ocean. I want to see the great big water." Stiff, bewildered, filled with ecstasy, they finally unloaded in front of a big white building that looked like a hotel. They tried to see into the deep, mysterious darkness across the road, where boomed a great voice that called them, and where dashing spray loomed high like a waving phantom hand to beckon them now and again, and far moving lights told of ships and a world beyond the one they knew, a wide, limitless thing like eternity, universe, chaos. With half reluctant feet they turned away from the mysterious unseen lure and let themselves be led across an unbelievably wide veranda into the bright light of a hall where everything was clean and shining, and a great fireplace filled with friendly flames gave cheer and welcome. The children stood bewildered in the brightness while 2 strange serving maids unfastened their wraps and dust cloaks and helped them take off their hats. Then they all sat around the fire, for Graham had come in by this time, and the maids brought trays of some delicious drink with little cakes and crackers and tinkling ice and straws to drink with. Doris almost fell asleep again, and was carried upstairs by Shirley and put to bed in a pretty white crib she was too sleepy to look at, while Carol, Elizabeth, George, and Harley went with Graham across the road to look at the black, yawning cavern they called ocean, and to have the shore lighthouses pointed out to them and named one by one. They were all